What's up everyone, my name is Nick and I am a super nice guy. And today I'm here to talk about a really big but really important topic, and that is accessibility in design, or designing for inclusivity. Let's get into it. So what exactly is accessibility? Well, there are a few definitions out there if you just look up what is accessibility, but here we'll look at what Interaction Design Foundation is saying, and that is accessibility is the concept of whether a product or service can be used by everyone, and also however they encounter it. So whatever context they may be viewing your product or service in. Accessibility laws are there as well, which exist to aid people with disabilities and look out for them to make sure people are adhering to these principles. And these specific guidelines that really define whether or not websites or products are being accessible fall under this wonderful website, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Though it says web, it's not exclusive to websites. There are a number of areas that overlap into mobile apps. I think just because mobile apps and smartphones came later than the internet, that hasn't been clearly defined as this here. And some of these more common disabilities that we think of when designing for accessibility are visual disabilities such as color blindness, auditory such as hearing difficulties, perhaps epilepsy and risk of seizures, or even cognitive disabilities like dyslexia or short-term memory. But if we look at Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, we can actually approach these in a little bit different way, which I think this is really smart and adds an extra level of context to what the user's situations might be. Microsoft, what they say is there is a permanent disability, there is a temporary disability, and a situational disability. So a permanent disability is if someone has lost their arm, they will forever be using your product or service with just one arm. However, if they have injured or broken their arm, then perhaps for 6 months they might not be using that arm, and that they will have one arm while they're using your product or service. And then the last one being a situational disability. If a parent is holding a baby, for example, they only have one arm to use your product or service. I think this is a really great way to approach inclusive and accessible design, because it's not just thinking about one select user type, but it's really thinking about how can we make this experience accommodate the most amount of users possible. Next, I wanted to jump into a really great resource for this topic, and that is Google's Accessibility for Teams. The reason I wanted to go into this, one, it has great content, but also I think when people talk about accessibility, there's oftentimes a lot of wondering of who does the responsibility fall onto? Is it the designers, the engineers, the product owners? Ultimately, I think it's a collection of all of those, but here in Google's Accessibility for Teams, we have some specific rules that a UX designer can apply. And so those rules might be content has sufficient color contrast, there are multiple ways to interact with the UI, there's a defined logical tab order and a clear focus state, and then controls have accessible labels. This first one here I think is one of the most used in a designer's tool set, and that is applying a color contrast ratio to everything you're doing, and so you're making sure that it's all perceived crisp and clear for everyone. There are a number of plugins out there that help you do that inside things like Figma and Sketch and so on, and I'll show in a second an example of that. And looking at this example that Google supplied, we can see clearly on the left the text is much more legible and easy to read than the text on the right, which is almost invisible. However, that isn't necessarily a rule of thumb, because sometimes people with strong vision perceive white to have a higher contrast ratio, when in fact it doesn't pass the contrast ratio standards at all. And so I'll show that in a second. But if you look below, Google says text and icons should aim for a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for smaller text and 3 to 1 for larger text. And then they consider 4-point bold to be the smaller text, the smallest possible, and then 18-point regular to be that larger text that can just have a 3 to 1 ratio. So looking at some examples of what not to do, the funny thing is I found this inspiration from an old hard drive from years ago, and I thought I was gonna use it in something. You might think all of this text looks accessible except for maybe the blue and the white here, but in fact I can tell you that all of this does not pass accessibility. That just comes from knowledge of attempting white text on these lighter colors, so I already know. But even though it looks crisp and clear, I can tell you it would not pass accessibility, and we can look at that right now. If I were to just draw up a quick shape layer here, and we can color drop something like that green, and then we can place some text over top. And it doesn't really matter to match the style, although that text also appears very tiny. But now we have two layers, we can use our plugin Stark and check contrast. I've actually created a hotkey for this because I use it quite a bit, and so I'll press that, and then we pull up this modal here, and we see not even close, 1.6 to 1.1. And what we see here are indications of AA accessibility standards and AAA. Typically what I've done in my agency work and what I mostly strive for, I guess professionally, is at least AA. If it's easy to make the colors AAA, then go for it, but AA at least ensures that there's an amount of accessibility applied to it. So we can also quickly just check these out and show really quick in real time. That one is 1.6 to 1.1, and then if I were to say maybe this purple, and that's a little higher at 2.1 but still well below. Of course orange is going to be very poor, 1.59 to 1, and so none of these pass accessibility. And I'm pretty sure this is something that may have been found on Dribbble, and so that's why I just want to caution people just getting into UI design to really look at this stuff and understand you can't necessarily just copy willy-nilly everything that you're finding on the internet, but there are rules and things that don't quite cut it in the professional world. So even though it looks great and pretty, I would say stay very far away from it. The next example here that Google talks about is the tab order is defined and in a logical way. Specifically, they say it should follow the layout of the way you would read the page, so things at the top and the most important first, and then you move your way down. I also want to add that with this, there should be a defined focus state example here, and this is a strong indication that you are on an input field or a button or anything that's interactable that can take you further through the experience. The next one here is controls have accessible labels. If a user is using assistive technology or screen readers or things like that, that's where these come into play. This magnifying glass, for example, is the search feature, but if it were to just say magnifying glass for the user when they were listening, they wouldn't quite know what that means. And so an accessible label for that would be search, and then it makes sense. It adds an affordance. And they also list the microphone would be voice search, and the more icon would be more options. Google also says that these labels should be succinct and use action verbs. And the last one here is there are multiple ways to interact with the UI, and one example of this is that color should not be the one element used to convey critical information. And an example of that would be if this input field just had a red bar on the bottom and then the label turned red. It really doesn't make any difference to the grayscale version, and if someone has color blindness, they're not necessarily perceiving an error. But if we add on an alert icon and an error message, then we have a second and a third element appearing that are independent of the color choices. And we can make them red just to be safe for everyone else. Alright, well that was a pretty quick-winded way to discuss accessibility in design. I just wanted to get the word out and show a few things that UX designers can do to make their designs a little bit more inclusive for everyone. If you find yourself wanting to learn more about this topic, I'm going to add some additional resources down below in the description and you can check those out. As always, if you got something from this video or you found it helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. Until next time, super nice guy out.